Many thanks, Charles, and many thanks to Charles and Minas for the invitation. I've been working off and on with Minas since 1997, when the payment, Charles was generous enough to give me cutting edge technology, a VHS recorder, which was cutting edge because the slot was in the middle. Oh, how things have changed. I returned from Iraq on Monday after an extended research trip there, mostly focused on Baghdad, where I met a number of senior government ministers, party leaders, protest organizers, and ordinary citizens. With an interlude for COVID, I've been making these regular research trips every few months for the last 7 or 8 years. And I must say, the mood in Baghdad amongst my Iraqi interlocutors, both members of the ruling elite and ordinary citizens, was as pessimistic as I've seen it for many years. The hope that the system might reform, triggered by the October 2019 protests and then the recent financial crisis, has clearly dissipated. No one I spoke to from across the governing elite, the protesters and citizens on the street, had any expectation that serious reform, whether political or economic, would take place in the near future. Finally, if national elections do take place in October, there are very low expectations for voter turnout and for the government that will result from the extended negotiations afterwards. So I think that covers the 5 points that I'm going to talk about: Iraq's current economic and political crisis, the dynamics of the present government, the October elections and their aftermath, the struggle to control politically motivated violence in Iraq, and then the political economy of doing business in Iraq. Charles, could you move the next slide, please? Right, so let's start with Iraq's multi-level crisis. I will briefly touch upon the economic crisis, but we'll leave the details and prognosis to a real expert who will come on next, Ahmed Tabaqchali. It's needless to say, while I was in Baghdad, Ahmed and I spent a great deal of time late into the night discussing the economic aspects of this crisis. And I think we share a prognosis, at least over the short to medium term. But let's start with the economic problems. In September 2020, the World Bank argued that Iraq was, quote, on the brink of an economic catastrophe. The impact of COVID-19 and the then collapse in international oil prices, the bank argued, was exacerbating economic and political crisis. This combination of new and existing pressures, the report added, could lead to an economic meltdown and a new cycle of violence and conflict. I think the current Deputy Prime Minister and Economic Minister, Ali Alawi, a self-styled, non-aligned technocrat with no formal or informal political constituency, has argued that severe economic consequences would result if the economy was not restructured radically. In an attempt to achieve this mammoth goal, Alawi and his team of doughty reformers drafted 2 white papers, one laying out the diagnosis of why Iraq is in such a profound pickle, and the second laying out both micro and macro plans for economic reform. Micro plans focused on government payrolls, pensions and other benefits. Micro plans focused on individual ministries, especially the Ministry of Finance, and what they needed to do on a case-by-case basis, systemizing and centralizing government data so that the Prime Minister's office and especially the Finance Ministry would actually know what state institutions are spending and can make then valid forecasts for economic planning. I think it's safe to say that Parliament and the wider ruling elite's response to Alawi's reform plans, and indeed the dire economic problems that Iraq faces, was a rude awakening for Minister Alawi. Far from agreeing with him and the World Bank that there was no alternative to these wide-ranging and disruptive economic reforms, the ruling elite at cabinet level and in the senior ranks of the civil service saw no reason whatsoever to change their behavior, to reduce spending, or to put it politely, lessen the resources that they extracted from the system and redistributed to the political parties. Ahmed will talk in greater detail about what happened to the Kadhimi government's budget in Parliament, but needless to say that both Alawi and Mustafa Kadhimi, the Prime Minister, are now under no illusion that the logic of economic reform will be actively and tenaciously opposed by the rest of the government, and beyond that, the wider ruling elite. To put it frankly, Ali Alawi, a man of great and impressive intent and integrity, does not have the power to deliver the transformatory aspects of the white paper that he has outlined in such great detail. If anything, I would argue Iraq's economic problems spring directly from its political problems. If we want to see the weight of these political problems, I think we need to look no further than the October 2019 protest movement. Now, there's been protests and demonstrations ongoing in Iraq since 2009, at least, focused on the inability of the Iraqi government to deliver fresh running water and sustainable and reliable power supplies to the population. However, the demonstrations that's flared in Baghdad and then every major urban conurbation across central and south Iraq from October 2019 were demographically and organizationally on a different scale to anything that's happened. This is the largest political movement that Iraq has seen at least since 2003. It was driven forward by young people from the urban conurbations of Iraq, mainly Baghdad and the cities of the south, Nasiriyah, all the way down to Basra. Of course, the majority of those of whom are of the Shia faith. What they were demanding was not simply more jobs or better electricity. They were demanding the complete transformation of the Iraqi political system. They were demanding an end to corruption that they saw as a direct product of the current Iraqi political system, and they were demanding the ouster of the ruling elite that's been in place since 2003. Now, this was a revolutionary movement and a movement that has dissipated, but it was a movement that it was driven forward by the powerful sacrifice of young Iraqis alienated from the political system without a hope of a better future. What did the government do? Well, there were theatrical attempts to meet the demands of the protesters, but running parallel to that and much more powerfully than that, the government and its allied forces outside on the street instigated a campaign of targeted assassinations, intelligence gathering on opposition movements, intimidation of activists, and a constriction on the freedom of the press. Thousands were arrested and tortured, 600 were killed and thousands more wounded. This campaign of covert assassinations directed at specific individuals using real-time intelligence has, if anything, become more focused in 2021 as we move towards elections. It's led by militias aligned to Iran, certainly, but who seem to enjoy impunity. It's a deliberate intention of targeting opposition activists in the run-up to the elections to fracture this movement, to neuter its danger, and to move back towards a system where the ruling elite dominate. Now, the economic crisis that the government faced, the protests of the October movement, and the inability of the current Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, to deliver sustainable economic reforms has quite simply removed the legitimacy of this government. Last time we had elections was in 2018. That resulted in the government of Adil Abdul Mahdi. He was removed because of the violence of the October 2019 protest movement. But what we've seen over many years, probably from 2010, is a steady decline in electoral participation, very negative opinion poll data, and a ruling elite in a political system that enjoy little support from across society, especially the demographic bulge, this mass wave of young people coming to fruition, coming to the electorate. Now, 15% of the electorate that will vote in October 2021 have never voted before. Charles, if you move to the next slide, please. So if we look at the present government of Mustafa al-Kadhimi, Mustafa al-Kadhimi became Prime Minister in October 2020, as I said, triggered by the resignation of Adil Abdul Mahdi, forced out in November 2019, when Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani delivered a strong criticism of the violence used in an attempt to control and repress the October revolution, October protest movement. Kadhimi was undoubtedly a compromise candidate of the last instance, after two other candidates officially selected and promoted by the president, Barham Saleh, refused to gain the support of enough members of parliament and the party political ruling elite behind that. Kadhimi used to be the head of intelligence, and before that was an oppositional journalist. He's a man undoubtedly of liberal intent, who, when he was running the intelligence service, used them to protect liberal journalists and protesters. However, he has little or no base of support within the ruling elite. The ruling elite are deeply ambiguous about his ties to the United States, about his past role as head of intelligence, and about his role as a liberal journalist before that. They accepted him in a moment of crisis after two previous candidates failed to get their backing, and they will work, I suspect, quite hard for him not to become prime minister after October 2021 elections. Now, Kadhimi's cabinet is indicative of the increasing power of political parties, the bedrock of the ruling elite in government. Up to 6 ministers in this new cabinet have long associations with the Sadrist movement when they were serving as senior civil servants, director generals in the ministries they now rule over as ministers. In addition, a whole host of other ministers promoted as technocrats from the ranks of the senior civil service into the cabinet were actually long-time party-aligned civil servants who were doing the party's bidding within government. So it's no surprise that Mustafa Kadhimi, elected on a wave of hope in the face of these protest movements, looking and promising to reform the government both economically, politically, and coercively, has achieved little or nothing. He has no power base within the ruling elite, to put it brutally, and I apologize for this. He's becoming a figure of derision within wider society as he keeps promising to do things, setting up committee after committee to investigate assassinations, investigate corruption, investigate a whole manner of things. Those committees don't deliver. There's a culture of impunity. And now he clearly has an increasingly transparent desire to obtain a second term as prime minister, which will undoubtedly and has undoubtedly involved him doing deals with senior party political figures, which further constrain him from moving forward with major political change. So if we were looking for harbingers of the post-October 2021 government, I think we'll see it dominated by party-aligned political figures in the cabinet, a weak prime minister whom we don't know, it could be Kadhimi just, but it's much more likely to be a second-tier party figure put in as a figurehead where the real power lies with the party bosses and their civil servants aligned to the parties at the senior echelons of the institutions of the state. Charles, can we have the next slide, please? Now let's look forward to the elections and their aftermath. The elections are due to be held on the 10th of October this year, though there are still various wings of the ruling elite that would like to see them postponed until 2022. There is, I think, and a big noise was made about this, a quite radical new election law ratified by President Barham Saleh in November 2020. The constituencies that MPs will be elected from have been changed from the 18 very large provincial districts to 83 electoral districts. The electoral system has moved away from voting for large coalitions where the parties have the choice about where they put their candidates on the electoral list and who is likely to be elected, to a first past the post race in each constituency. The new electoral law has been sold to the Iraqi population that members of parliament will be directly connected to their constituencies and answerable to them. However, large parties with regional or national aspirations and the resources and the institutions to deliver them should be able to mobilize across numerous constituencies and once again dominate the parliament. Small local parties may be able to concentrate their resources in single electoral districts and bring to parliament a myriad of independent constituency, independent members of parliament. However, the parties seeking to represent the October 2019 protest movement, the voice of alienation and political mobilization, are unlikely to make much headway, if any, in these elections. Firstly, their voter base may well be national, not concentrated in specific constituencies. Secondly, they don't have the resources, networks, and people to mobilize nationally. The High Electoral Council charges 30 million dinars, around $20,000, to register a new party. Each founding member needs 2 million dinars to push that party to registration, with 3,000 signatures across 3 provinces. Basically, the law, although fracturing voter participation into smaller constituencies, favors large, institutionally established and wealthy parties. Much more important than that, the October Revolution, October movements, activists have been subject to a planned and strategically targeted campaign of intimidation and assassination. This has been specifically designed to break their ability to organize, to neuter the threats that they posed. Numerous assassinations have taken place across Baghdad and the south of Iraq. On the 9th of May in Karbala, Al-Wanzi, a political activist trying to drive forward the protest movement, was murdered outside his house. Just 24 hours later, Ahmed Hussein, a journalist, was assassinated in Diwaniyah. So I think we need to look at these elections with a realistic set of analytical eyes and say that they will be dominated by the old coalitions, primarily, I think, the Sadrists, who have got the most votes in each national election, I think since 2010, and who are very organized, very well financially endowed, and can then move their people across the south of Iraq, dominating the constituencies where they're almost certain to gain MPs. The second major force will be Fatah, previously dominated by the militia Badr, now with Asab al-Haq coming up to prominence. This is basically the coalition that represents the militias that were re-empowered in the fight against the Islamic State after 2014. There certainly, as I indicated, will be independence, but whether these can be molded into any form of reliable counter bloc in parliament, I think is highly unlikely. The turnout for the 2018 elections was officially around 44%, but on the ground estimates would put it much lower. If national election turnout drops in 2021 to under 40%, which is very likely, it is going to be amongst the lowest turnouts of parliamentary elections worldwide. This has been exacerbated by a grassroots movement calling for a boycott, saying elections have no meaning when electoral campaigners are being assassinated and when they will be dominated by the old parties. And so I think prospects for post-election government formation will look very similar to the negotiations that happened in the 2 elections in 2005, election 2010, 14 and 18. You will have the dominant coalitions of the old ruling elite coming together to negotiate a government of national unity, where the ministries will be divided and the senior civil servants will be divided amongst those dominant parties, with a smattering of technocrats, people like Ali Alawi, possibly in the Ministry of Finance, that will give the government a rough and ready form of legitimacy, but will have no power to implement meaningful reform that challenges the vested interests of the political parties. Next slide, please. Now, let me just touch upon the struggle to control politically motivated violence. I think the first thing to stress is that militias, the main militia, people I mentioned like Badr and Asab al-Haq, are not outside the state. there isn't a juxtaposition between the state institutions and the ruling elite and these militias. These militias have mobilized, integrated themselves into the Ministry of Interior, to some extent into the Ministry of Defense before 2014, and have occupied a seat within the cabinet and the table around which the ruling elite negotiate. These militias played a central role after 2014 in fighting the Islamic State, were integrated into this umbrella Hashd-e-Shaabi organization that brought the militias together in that fight. And as such, they are formed into battalions that are paid for directly by the Iraqi state. So the militias like Badr and Asab al-Haq actually have ministers, they control ministries and have a position in the cabinet, in parliament, where they lobby for ever increasing sections of the national budget. I moved then down to the politics of impunity. I was in Baghdad along with Ahmed on May 26th, when Qasim Musla, the head of the Hashd operations in Anbar and the commander of Tafuf brigade, was arrested. He was arrested after he'd been hiding for several days in the south of Iraq. He was caught coming through Dora, an area of Baghdad famous for its power station, and brought in to the custody of the government. Musla was suspected of has been accused of the murder of protesters in Karbala and the sponsoring or organizing attacks on other activists involved in firing rockets at the Ain al-Assad base in Anbar, where the US are based. His arrest on the same day led to an immediate confrontation between the pro-Iranian Hashid units stationed inside the Green Zone, others brought in through Gate 5 of the Green Zone that they managed easily to overrun and come into. They surrounded strategic buildings in the Green Zone and demanded their comrades' release. What happened next is open to contestation, but certainly Musla was moved from formal incarceration into a much more comfortable surroundings. Rumor has it that although technically under the control of the Joint Operations Command, which includes the Hashid, he's actually staying in the head of the Hashid's house, Falah al-Fayyad. Whatever the case, it is highly unlikely that his movements or actions will be constrained and possibly beyond the imagination of Iraq's population that he will ever see trial for the crimes he's alleged to commit. Which leads us to the last point on this slide, the future of the militias. I think there's no doubt that the myriad of militias who were re-empowered after 2014 are a major factor on Iraq's political landscape. They've diversified from their coercive role into economic activity and to political mobilization. They will run in the elections where they will gain MPs and probably seats at the cabinet table. They're integrated into the ruling formula and the elite pack that dominates Iraq, and as such, they gain resources directly from the Iraqi state and impunity from justice to do what they want in terms of intimidation. The Iraqi state isn't directly threatened by them because they are now part of the Iraqi state. What they desire is the legitimacy comparable possibly to the military forces up in Kurdistan, the Peshmerga, that allows them to operate as a standard arm of the Iraqi armed forces, and they're pretty close to that. My last slide is entitled The Political Economy of Interacting with the Iraqi Government, and that has three points on it. The first big point is to recognize what I've been hinting at all the way through this talk. Politics in Iraq and government formation in Iraq is based on an elite pact. The leaders of major political parties since 2003 have been brought into the Iraqi government. In 2005, 10, 14, 18, and again in 2021, they will engage in electoral contestation. As a reward for that, the negotiations after the elections will focus not only on the division of ministerial appointments and the budgets that come with them amongst these party political leaders, but also since at least 2014, negotiations will surround the appointment of senior party-aligned civil servants. It is those civil servants who control government contracting, the allocation and the competition over government contracts, major financial contracts that usually go to business people aligned with the political parties. This has given rise to contract corruption. The head of the Integrity Committee, who is in charge of trying to constrain this, called the contracting system the mother of all corruption issues in Iraq. This directly then has a follow-on effect to the costs of business. If you are a foreign firm seeking to do business in Iraq, you will have to map out and negotiate a political system where power very often doesn't lie in the hands of the minister or the formal institutions of the state, but through them and senior civil servants lies in what's called the economic or financial office of the major political parties. Doing business is fraught with complexity, non-transparency, and the ever-present threat of corruption. So my final slide is a conclusion. I'm not in any way saying Iraq is on the verge of another civil war or that the Islamic State is going to make a comeback. What I am saying is the Iraqi political system, dominated by major political parties, legitimized since 2003 through the claim that they represent Iraq's sub-national ethnic and religious communities. These major political parties not only dominate government formation and the cabinet, since 2010-14, they dominate the institutions and the civil service that run the Iraqi state. This has led to profound corruption that has asset stripped the Iraqi state. It's led to the enfeeblement of Iraqi institutions that cannot and never have been able to deliver electricity or clean running water in a sustainable fashion to the majority of the population. And it has now led to the wholesale alienation of the population from the ruling elite and the state. This may well, I think, lead to a very, very low electoral turnout in October 2021, leaving those parties unchallenged, and they are unchallenged, and the protest movement of 2019 didn't result in sustained and meaningful change because violence, the suppression of peaceful political protest, the constraint of freedom of expression now underpins this system, and because of its illegitimacy is the main pillar of elite and party rule in Iraq. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Toby. As depressing as ever, unfortunately. Ahmed, perhaps you can say something that might be a little more encouraging. So over to you, Ahmed.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Charles, and thank you, Minister Associates. And thank you all for attending. Yes, I mean, I will be somewhat less, well, I don't know. I mean, I suppose my sort of like long-term prognosis pretty much dovetails with what Toby is arguing. However, I'm going to be departing on that somewhat short-term, precisely because of what you see in front of you. But before we go on, and pretty much to support the points that Toby has made, and I think it's really quite crucial because they are, in a sense, crucial to understanding Iraq and how our economy works. I was either fortunate or, yeah, let's use the word fortunate to be one of the co-authors of the white paper, and particularly on the process of the analysis. Basically, the essence of the paper, the real heart of it, is that Iraq's economic problems pretty much are a direct consequence of its politics, of its political system. It basically is no different than in the past. It basically is a state where the role of the state, sorry, a country or an economy where the role of the state has grown so large in society as well as an economy. And all that really has changed post-2003 is that we have a decentralized version of the disease that we had before then. And in fact, I think the same role of the state is The same, I think, to a much lesser extent, obviously, the same in the rest of the region. So I don't think the GCC, for example, is different from us, but crucially where they are is that their state has a monopoly of power and they haven't gone as far as we have. We have, what we have is a monster version or a Frankenstein version of this with multiple heads in it. The basic essence of it is therefore when looking at the reform or looking at the reform package, the paper or the analysis has argued that it is almost next to impossible to work on it because of the various issues there are: the role of the state, the weakness of the institution, the role of corruption, but crucially, the weakened institutional structure and the politicization of the civil service. So even the idea was that even in my mind at the time, even if the stars were aligned, even if almost everybody had followed the vision of Alawi at the time, Minister Alawi, it would have been very difficult to implement simply because of the lack of capacity. I think this is a crucial issue what we have. So basically at the time was, if that is the case, why look at reform? Why is reform necessary? The fact is reform is incredibly necessary for Iraq, and it has to come one way or the other, because of our demographics. Our demographics are, we are growing more like a sub-Saharan African country than Iraq, and we depend on resources that are long-term declining. What happens basically because of the role of the state, because of our structure, we have become incredibly vulnerable to any external shocks. And what happened over the last few years, we had quite a few economic shocks. So if you go back, I mean, the chart here looks at oil prices, but it doesn't look early enough. But we had a crisis in 2000 and, the financial crisis. Then we had the crisis in 2014, 2017, and the last one. The thing is that what happens with us, and it's pretty crucial, is our spending, the largest element of our spending as a state goes on salaries and pensions. And if you look at those as a percentage of our oil revenues, in the first crisis, i.e. financial crisis of 2008-9, they consumed something like 60% of the oil revenues. So even when oil revenues collapsed, they consumed 60% of that, which basically gave us enough bandwidth to tackle the other issues, i.e. allowed the state to function. Fast forward the last crisis, the 2014-2017, that same figure became 88%, which means 12% was left to run the state during a crisis, which is not enough at all. And what we've done is that we resorted to borrowing, and we pretty much used up the potential of international borrowing as well as domestic borrowing. Last year's crisis, which brought the new government and which led to the formation of the paper, saw us in a way whereby the crash in oil prices and the rigidity of our spending led to the result that our salaries and pensions consumed something like 120% of all our oil revenues, and borrowing was not available, and all of these issues. The problem that we have in Iraq is basically we always get bailed out either by fortune or by an act of God. And in our case, it's been oil prices. It's the same thing that can kill us, can also rebound us. I mean, we always go from feast and famine. I think even, historically, if you go the dependence on the rivers either fed us or they flooded us and killed us. The same thing with our oil prices. Going back to the state, the problem, what happens is that the political elite or the governing elite, every time we emerge from a crisis, instead of doing some sort of reform, they almost double down on the issue, which means it makes us progressively weaker and weaker and weaker. So the next crisis, when it comes, I think we will be in a position that will make last year look like a picnic. However, I'm looking short term right now, and the same short term for us is what will spark I think a powerful economic recovery in Iraq, or more like an economic rebound, which is extremely leveraged to the economic rebound that the world is seeing. What you see in front of you is oil prices, and you look exactly a year ago here as we're looking at Brent, but if somebody was looking at West Texas, we would have negative oil prices, and the end of the world was pretty much called in order. Now, we have Brent prices pretty much exceeding $70 a barrel and potentially going a few dollars higher. They are basically as a result of the world economy rebounding significantly, mostly the developed world, led by the incredible amount of fiscal stimulus that has put enormous amount of money in people's hands in a way that we have not seen before. And I'm pretty much paraphrasing or borrowing a phrase used by the UK's chief economist, the Bank of England chief economist, when he called on, I call on the economics of Cold Springs, crouching tigers and chicken lickens, in the sense of expecting a massive economic recovery for the UK, but pretty much that's what we're going to see in the world. And Iraq, one or the other, is extreme leverage to that. So the same thing that killed us last year and led to the economic crisis and started the whole soul searching and starting with a reform package is working the reverse for us. I mean, we are now having more oil revenues, even though the prices are lower, than we've had in our heyday, simply because higher oil production, even in spite of OPEC cuts. By the way, I apologize, I am in Baghdad, and we are witnessing what we Baghdadis call Christmas tree, which is basically the power cuts on and off as we go. But that same leverage works for us significantly, and that's what's driving us. So what does it mean for the economy? And I'm just looking, by the way, short term, so something a view of 6 to 18 months, and that pretty much is directly dependent on the world. Keeping in mind, by the way, the risks are enormous to this, in the sense that the economic rebound pretty much hinges on the rate of vaccination in the West, the development of variants. But for oil prices, we have an additional one, which is the question of supply. We still have significant amount of supply that's being held in check because of the OPEC agreement, which so far is holding. And every indication says it will hold for the next year, but you know, there's always buts, and there's all the issues there. But with that, we have that. So what does Iraq look like right now, without me using too much time? If you can have the next slide, Charles, please. Okay, here I am looking at what basically is the form of cold springs, and that is liquidity. So Iraq is an economy that's predominantly cash based, and so therefore I'm looking at M0, which is basically the monetary base. It's actually the pure, just the money that runs the economy. And as you can see, by the way, we have at the overall level, the charts on the left-hand side, I'm comparing. The left-hand side is our oil revenues per month in Iraqi dinars versus the money supply. And the left is the absolute money supply. On the right is the money supply year-to-year growth, just to give you a sense of how much there is. And as you can see, our money supply is high, dependent on oil revenues. So even last year, when we had no oil revenues to speak of, we still had a growth in the money supply, and that was a function of the government borrowing and expanding the monetary base, i.e. what was called indirect monetary financing. All in all, that led to an enormous amount of liquidity that you can see in Baghdad right now. Obviously, that liquidity does not mean it translates into spending, because that's money in people's hand. And where is that liquidity coming from? It comes in from the same thing that makes us ill, and that's basically the public sector payroll. So the public sector payroll, which is the largest component of our spending, stood in 2019 at something like $53 trillion. In this year's budget, it is something like, I actually am using the amended one. So basically you're looking at cuts, and that's something that increased by about 18% this year. So you're looking at something equivalent to a 7% liquidity injection into the non-oil economy. So that's one element of it. The other element that is going to kick in is government spending on goods and services. Last year, we had no budget, so basically, and no oil revenues, and we only focused on paying salaries and pensions, so we had no spending on goods and services. This year, we have the money to spend on that. You add those two, and that's just current spending, that's about 14% liquidity added into the economy. That's pretty much money in people's pockets one way or the other, indirectly, if it works. If you believe the capital budget, and I don't believe, because we never really spend it, but if the capital budget does come into force, and there is a big if, and I think at best 40% of it might come, that itself in its totality adds 11% liquidity. So almost like you're pouring fuel on fire. And what evidence do I have on that? Next, Charles, please. Next slide, please, Charles. Here I'm looking at what is called a high frequency data, which is Google's mobility data. And that basically looks at footfall and traffic and not transactions. And as you can see, almost like everywhere in the world, this basically compares in each one of those. The green is grocery and pharmacy, and you have retail and recreation, going to office. It compares it to a baseline, which is basically a month from early January to early Feb 2000. And it compares, week on how that thing is. We get the zigzags because of the days of the week. And as you can see, like everywhere in the world, we went into an extreme shock at the beginning of the year when we had the lockdowns. But as they ease throughout the summer, and you can see how much growth as we've seen, we're way ahead in terms of footfall traffic than anything we've had. We're almost like in terms of pharmacies and groceries, over 100% than what we were in ahead of January of pre-COVID. The same thing with spending on retail. Now, I don't think much of that has yet translated into actual spending, because I talked to a number of companies in the food and beverages and so forth. They haven't seen that yet, but nevertheless, if that's the reason why we think of it in terms of crouching tigers, because if the amount of money and the activity do translate, then you can have a massive economic rebound. Next slide, Charles, please. And I think I've used up my 10 minutes. Here is an indirect way of looking at that. Here is the volume of transactions in Iraqi dinars in the central bank's what is called auction window, although it's actually not an auction. It used to be an auction in the early days, but we stuck with it. And the official name is the window for this and that, which is too long, so we end up always using auctions, but they're not auctions. But basically, as you can see, we've had a slowdown, and that was inspired by the COVID lockdown. And I use these, by the way, as a proxy for consumer spending. It's not a perfect proxy in any ways, but since we depend on imports to fuel everything we need, I pretty much use that as a way to give me some sort of confirmation, because that's almost like a proxy of imports. The green lines are imports, are transfers, i.e. for paying for input through banks. The red lines are cash transactions. And as you can see, we had a slowdown. There immediately was a shock and a system paralysis for a few weeks after the devaluation in late December. And now, once the budget was passed, the volume in dinar terms pretty much are exceeding most of what we've had last year. They're nowhere near the levels of 2019 yet, but that's a fairly hefty. I mean, I think there's an element of it which is capital flight, but nevertheless, that is fairly significant. And if I may have the last slide, Charles, please. If I remember, there was the last slide. Okay, here comes into the way where Iraq is viewed, and that, as you can see, there's always a prognosis, a worst case prognosis for Iraq, and that's Iraq is going to end. So here are a few of the headlines that happened at the same time last year, and you can see pretty much every news analysis pretty much calling the end of the world for Iraq. I mean, I was one of those last year, but at least in my defense, I was arguing that we cannot go bankrupt yet, because even at the worst of the economic crisis last year, even when things were horrendous, Iraq still managed to sell something like $45 billion worth of oil. Okay, 10 of that would have to go to the cost of producing it, but still has a very significant one. So end of the day, I think to end this is, there is a great deal of misconception on Iraq's economy and Iraq's leverage to oil prices. And this always comes in, which pretty much sometimes tends to kill investments, and it tends to kill looking into Iraq, because you read these last year's figures and you think the world is ending as far as Iraq is concerned. And Iraq does recover. It doesn't recover, by the way, through its own acts. I have to say, because it always does that through an act of God or luck. I mean, in terms of act of God, we have the rain season a couple of years ago. Okay, this year's a very dry year, but 2019, 2020 were very wet years. They solved a lot of our problems. Our economy, one of the greatest drivers of the oil economy in the last couple of years, was our agricultural sector. But it's purely a function of rain as opposed to anything that we do. Ultimately, what I'll end this is, yes, I think for the next 6 to 18 months, Iraq will see a significant economic rebound. There is no will for reform. There is a need for reform, but as long as oil prices are high, I cannot see that happening at all. I can only see it happening if we end up by having 2 bad years. We haven't had 2 bad years, at least as far as oil prices go, or as far as the world aids us. But once this is over, the prognosis, I think, is much starker for us, because without doing anything, all that we've done this year is that we've pretty much pushed our problems, to the future. Should anything happen with the price of oil, and there are many reasons why they should, i.e. the long-term demand for oil and all of that put in terms, and our growing demographics will put us in a difficult part, but that's where I will end. Short-term, incredibly positive. Long-term, there's a lot to be worked on.
Okay, thank you very much for that lightning tour of the economy. Tawfiq, over to you, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Tawfiq Tabbaa. I'm the Regional Managing Partner for Evershed Sutherland in the Middle East and heading the Iraq practice since 2004. Just very few words about the firm. We're a global law firm with 69 offices globally, 3,000 lawyers, which is rather a scary number for those who deal with lawyers. In the Middle East, next slide, please. We operate in 7 offices, 2 of which are in Iraq. And a matter of fact, we are the only international law firm with offices in Iraq. Next slide, please. Again, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the firm. Maybe just to say a few words. Iraq is a wonderful country with wonderful people. It's been my substantive practice actually since 2004. This is why I feel very comfortable, like the 2 speakers before me who did a great job to speak about Iraq, because it's whatever I say is out of love for the country. Next slide, please. So I borrowed the title of my regulatory update from a very famous Clint Eastwood movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But I tried to be less dramatic with my title. But I hope it'll give you a flavor of the latest news and issues on the legal front. Next slide, please. Sorry, that's fine. We are at good. No, before. Sorry, we're still at the one before, please. Sorry, Charles. So yeah, let's start with the good. Good news, we had Parliament approve a law that exceeded Iraq to the New York Convention for enforcement of arbitral awards. For those of you who know a bit about this, this is a key convention that basically allows private parties who were in arbitration to enforce in member states. The New York Convention has 160 plus countries, and Iraq has been one of the very few countries who've been lagging behind. This is good news, but unfortunately, I'm going to dilute it a bit by saying that we have been waiting now for almost 2 months for the law to be issued in the official gazette, which is the only time when the law becomes law. And we may be wrong about the information that we have, but it seems that the delay is intentional now. We, of course, hope it does not last too long. But again, this is a very important milestone. Iraq really needs this. It does give a lot of investor confidence. In terms of the investment framework, I think there are some good or enhancements, let's call it. The law itself has not changed over the past year. The law on paper is very good. It is within international standards. Practice has been different though. And I think there's a bit of a renewed vigor in the process, streamlining the process for foreign investment. And recently the Prime Minister, for example, has given ultimatums to all projects that have stalled to get to act together or lose their licenses. I think this is badly needed. People have been sitting on projects and trying to sometimes even, sell off those projects at a premium without them doing really much work. So I think this is a good thing. Good news on the renewable energy. The cabinet recently awarded 3 consortiums to build 7 solar power plants with a total capacity of 750 megawatts, which is very good. I think it just shows that there is a robust environment for private PPPs. Only just before the session, I just read some confirmed news. It seems that Total also has been awarded a 1,000 megawatt solar project in Iraq. So all of this is very good news. It just shows that Iraq is in business and there are positives. Unfortunately, from now on, I'd be less positive, but I think that's fine. We want to give you a true picture of what's going on. So this we'll start with the not so good. And I'm going to start with the oil and gas sector, which actually surprisingly has seen some action lately, which is very welcome news because there has been stagnation for a while. Unfortunately, to provide an update, I do have to give you a bit of history. So I apologize if many of you know this already. In 2005, I have to take you back a bit, Iraq adopted a new constitution. Unfortunately, since that time, Iraq struggled to interpret Articles 111 and 112 of the constitution, which were written on all good intention to say that oil is the property of the Iraqi people and its revenues should be shared in an equitable manner. The idea was then there would be a regulatory reform in this sector would be composed of 4 laws, essentially, dealing with hydrocarbon management, energy sector regulation, oil revenue distribution, etc. Again, unfortunately, this process remained stalled because of key differences between the federal government and the Kurdistan region, mainly, and other elements of society over the interpretation of these clauses. So since 2017, all Iraqi governments failed to pass any of those 4 original laws, and which ended up with Baghdad and Erbil running their own separate programs amid disputes over who has the right to sell oil, who has the right to cash its proceeds, and how revenues are to be distributed in the federal budget. Out of the original 4 bills or 4 laws that were envisaged, only one has advanced, which is the Iraq National Oil Company law, INOC. In essence, I can say maybe that the passage of the INOC law circumvented those issues by almost pretending they don't exist, which was an odd way to do it, maybe just to show progress. So this happened in 2018. And, as I said, it ignored certain issues, including, for example, Kurdistan's region's oil and revenues and what's generated from there. So under the INOC law, the company would assume responsibility for day-to-day sector operations, leaving the oil ministry to function primarily as a regulator. And the idea, again, was that all operating companies would be spun off from the ministry and folded under the INOC as direct subsidiaries. Various other things about the INOC law, that 90% of the profits generated would go into the state treasury, but the legislators could reduce that while voting for the federal budget. According to the law, the remainder would be distributed between capital reserves and of the company and a citizens fund, where each actually Iraqi residing in the country is entitled to 1 equal share. All excellent intentions. And of course, the creation of future generations funds, similar to what, for example, Kuwait and other GCC countries have. And some money also left for strategic projects. And again, giving a lot of power to the board of that company. Again, the story doesn't end there. Unfortunately, following the passage of the law in 2018, coincidentally before the May elections of that year, its implementation was quickly derailed by legal challenges, Iraq's highest court subsequently ruling that numerous and key provisions of the law were unconstitutional. So the most, and I come to to the news, let's say, or the update on this, is that there's been some interesting action recently on this. And this is the first time we see this since 2018. A few months ago, a parliamentary committee on oil and gas approved amendments to the INOC law, including provisions that address the problems and the legal challenges that first appeared in 2018. Unfortunately, today there will be little time for me to go into the details of those amendments, but in essence, they try to overhaul the governance of the INOC, which again was a key point for a lot of the population. For example, giving Parliament the right to approve the company's chairman. It prohibits the sale of the shares of the company and contains robust language to ensure that oil is legally designated as the property of the Iraqi people. Unfortunately, one major criticism of the INOC law is that it should not exist, or should only exist after the federal oil and gas law comes into force, and not the other way around. And maybe that's a good start to brings us into the next update in this maybe ongoing saga or drama, is the federal oil and gas law. So that law, which often is referred to as the hydrocarbons law, was a goal set for Iraq, actually, frankly speaking, during the Bush administration, when Iraq was still under occupation between 2013 and 2006. And in 2006, there was a draft law that was prepared by true specialists, but then, and there were lots of edits, I'd say, by politicians seeking to put more control in the hands of provinces. And the KRG ultimately led, so between the provinces and the KRG's push, the authors, the true authors of this initiative just could not, simply had to walk away. They could not defend what was happening. So due to the failure to enact the hydrocarbon law, the Kurdistan government passed its own law and created an independent oil sector, furthering its own interpretation of the Iraqi constitution. So they signed a dozen of PSAs, and building its own midstream infrastructure, and beginning also autonomous exports via Turkey as of 2014. Of course, despite the legal objections and political oppositions from Baghdad. But of course, Baghdad did its own licensing round starting in 2009. So in essence, the country has two separate oil regimes operating within its borders. And this is, it's a fact. And yes, the KRG has been sued by the Iraqi state in the Supreme Court since 2012, but that has stalled. There is an ICC arbitration against Turkey because it's seen as it's violated the agreement between Iraq and Turkey pipeline. But, and how can I say this in very few words? So this is far from legally, far from legality or commercial sense. It's very much a political battle full of sensitivities and interests. So as one final but important update is that the committee of experts at the Ministry of Oil recently, maybe last month, approved a new version of the federal oil law. Quite a big step, because that has been dormant for many years now, and sent it for Parliament for adoption. So quite an interesting move, between the amendments of the proposed amendments on the INOC, proposed amendments on the federal oil and gas law. Are we seeing a serious attempt? Could be. The timing is certainly very interesting. It's, we just heard that the elections will happen in October, or supposedly will happen in October, and whether there will be political appetite to progress these two very key laws in Parliament by the government. So again, remains to be seen.
2 to 3 minutes, please.
All right, sorry. So next slide, please. I think I've spent quite a lot on oil and gas, but I think that is quite key. I'll just say here on the not so good, I'm not going to tackle every three. On the bilateral investment treaties, Iraq continues to really lag behind. Iraq only has 3 active BITs. These are very key for investors to feel that they're protected. One with Kuwait, one with Japan, and one with Jordan. Compared, for example, to Iran, which is bordering Iraq, it has around 70 bilateral investment treaties. So clearly there's a lot to do there. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to just quickly pick and choose some of the bads that I feel, again, the ease of doing business or lack of it. We've heard Toby speak about this at the end of his presentation. It is draining sometimes to do business. World Bank ranks Iraq at the bottom of the list, and it's not by coincidence. The laws actually on paper, a lot of them are actually good. They follow good models and so on. Just the way they're interpreted and when that big bureaucracy of Iraq tries to help or not help investors, this is where you get into a lot of issues, combined, of course, with corruption and other obstacles. And I'll just give you an example. Iraq, until up to 2019, had an excellent companies law that allowed 100% foreign ownership. And in September, there was a law that now reduced that to 49%. At a time when Dubai and Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf are actually opening up their economies for 100% ownership. We know who was behind that change of law. There is a small lobby who actually wanted to sort of act as sponsors and act like rainmakers to make sure that foreign investors can never come to the country alone and have to actually tie up with some of the local. So again, with a complex tax regime and corruption. And one final thing, and this is, Charles, I promise this is my last point, is there is a paralysis of decision-making in the Iraqi state. Even when you have let's say, a good civil servant who wants to take the right decision, they'd rather pass the bucket and not make a decision because of scrutiny, political issues, and so on. This has created a bottleneck of issues for foreign investors. It has actually opened up a lot of litigation against some of the Iraqi state players, including state-owned companies, because of this paralysis in decision-making, which is very unfortunate. Sorry, I hope, like my 2 other colleagues, I did not paint a too gloomy of a picture, but I think it is a true picture. Lots of great things. Just finally on the oil, Iraq's export in May actually beat Saudi Arabia, if I read the reports correctly. Yes, that's a fortune, but it can be also what brings challenges to Iraq. Thank you again. Sorry if I took too longer than I should have, Charles.